Imagine looking up at the summer sky and seeing not clouds, but hundreds of aircraft, engines roaring, bombs falling, your entire country hanging in the balance, decided not on land or sea, but in the air. In the summer of 1940, this was not a movie. This was reality for millions of people in Britain, and for a few thousand young pilots whose job was simple and impossible at the same time. Stop the Luftwaffe or lose the war. This is the story of the Battle of Britain, the first major campaign in history fought entirely by air forces, and the moment when, as Winston Churchill said, "The Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin." By June 1940, Europe was collapsing. Nazi Germany had overrun Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France in less than a year. The British Expeditionary Force barely escaped from Dunkirk, leaving behind most of its heavy equipment. On the map, it looked simple. Germany dominated the continent. Italy had joined the Axis. The Soviet Union was still bound by a pact with Hitler. The United States was officially neutral. And in the middle of this stormy sea, one island remained defiant: Britain. If Hitler wanted to finish the job, he had a problem. To invade Britain, he needed to cross the English Channel with ships and soldiers. But he could not do that if the Royal Air Force still controlled the skies. So the German plan was clear. First, destroy the RAF. Second, control the air over southern England and the Channel. Third, launch the invasion, known as Operation Sea Lion. What followed would become known as the Battle of Britain, fought between July 10th and October 31, 1940. To understand this battle, we need to know who was fighting. On one side was the Luftwaffe, Nazi Germany's air force, fresh from victory over France. It had thousands of aircraft, bombers like the Heinkel He-111, the Dornier Do-17, and the Junkers Ju-88, the infamous Stuka dive bombers, and fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-109. On paper, the Luftwaffe had more planes than the RAF, and far more recent combat experience. On the other side was RAF Fighter Command. It looked small and vulnerable, but it had some powerful advantages. First, the aircraft. The Hawker Hurricane was tough and stable, built partly of wood and fabric. Excellent as a gun platform, it would actually shoot down more enemy aircraft than any other RAF fighter in the battle. The Supermarine Spitfire was fast, elegant, and highly maneuverable. With its iconic elliptical wings, it was perfect for dogfights against the Bf-109 and quickly became a legend. Second, there was the system behind the fighters. Britain had created something entirely new, an integrated air defense system. Along the coast stood tall radar masts, part of a network called Chainhome. These antennas could detect incoming German aircraft while they were still forming over France and the Channel. Radar stations passed information to filter rooms and then to Fighter Command headquarters. From there, officers directed squadrons to intercept the enemy at the right time and place. For the first time in history, a country was using radar, radio, ground observers, and centralized command to control its fighters like pieces on a chessboard. Germany did not fully understand how this system worked, and that would be one of the reasons they failed. In May 1940, as France was falling, Britain changed leaders. Neville Chamberlain stepped down, and Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. Where others thought about negotiation, Churchill was clear. Britain would fight on, whatever the cost. He warned his people that the worst was still to come. He understood that if the RAF lost, there would be nothing to stop German ships crossing the Channel. Britain could be forced into surrender or occupation. Later, as the battle reached its peak, Churchill said a line that would become famous around the world: "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Those few were the young men who climbed into Hurricanes and Spitfires every day, knowing they might not come back. The Battle of Britain did not begin with massive bombing of London. At first, it was more limited and focused. Between July 10th and early August, the Luftwaffe concentrated on targets like shipping in the English Channel, coastal ports and radar stations, with occasional raids on airfields. The idea was to weaken Britain's ability to trade and to probe the RAF's defenses. For the pilots, it meant constant scrambles. You might be on the ground, drinking tea, when the phone rang and a single word came down from the control room. Scramble. Within seconds, pilots rushed to their aircraft, started engines, and raced down the runway. They climbed into the sky, guided by radio from ground controllers who had seen the enemy on radar. Sometimes they found nothing. Sometimes they found a few bombers. And sometimes the sky suddenly filled with German aircraft. The casualties in this early phase were heavy, but not yet decisive. It felt like the build-up to something bigger. By August, the German High Command believed it was time to increase the pressure. The Luftwaffe leadership decided to focus more directly on destroying the RAF. They believed that if they could wreck fighter airfields, damage aircraft factories, and kill or exhaust RAF pilots, then Britain's defenses would collapse. German intelligence, however, was overconfident. They underestimated the number of British aircraft, and they did not understand how the radar-based system worked. Still, the next phase of the battle would be brutal. In August 1940, the Luftwaffe launched large-scale raids, testing British defenses and trying to draw the RAF into a war of attrition. The skies over southern England turned into a deadly arena, with fighter formations clashing at high speed, machine guns chattering, engines screaming, and pilots making life-or-death decisions in seconds. For the people on the ground, the battle sounded like distant thunder. For the men in the air, it was a constant gamble. Attack the bombers and risk being jumped by fighters, or dogfight the escorts and let the bombers through. Either way, every day, more planes went down into the fields, into the channel, and into the streets below. Day after day, the pressure increased. August became a month of fire. The Luftwaffe started sending bigger and bigger formations across the channel. Waves of bombers, protected by layers of fighters above and around them. For RAF Fighter Command, every day felt like a test of survival. Squadrons were scrambled again and again. Pilots landed with almost empty fuel tanks, rearmed, refueled, and went straight back up. Some barely had time to step out of the cockpit before they were ordered into the air again. The battle was no longer just about machines, it was about human endurance. Many RAF pilots were incredibly young. Some were barely out of school, only a few weeks removed from training, and suddenly thrown into combat against experienced German fighter aces. They lived a strange double life. One moment they were sitting in a quiet dispersal hut, smoking, drinking tea, joking with friends, trying to pretend everything was normal. The next moment, the phone rang, squadron scramble, and a few minutes later, they were fighting for their lives at 20,000 feet, surrounded by tracers, explosions, and flames. Losses were heavy on both sides. Every day, British newspapers printed lists of names, pilots missing, killed, badly wounded. Airfields in southern England were bombed again and again. Hangars burned. Runways were cratered. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Ground crews worked under the danger of new raids, repairing what they could, filling bomb craters, pushing damaged fighters aside so that others could take off. From the outside, it looked as if Britain might be nearing its limit, but there was something the Germans did not expect. The Royal Air Force was not only British. Pilots came from across the empire and from occupied countries: Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, pilots from Czechoslovakia, Belgium, France, and especially from Poland and other nations under German occupation joined the fight. Some had already lost their homelands. Now, in the skies over England, they saw a chance to strike back. Polish fighter squadrons in particular quickly gained a fierce reputation. They were aggressive, determined, and often refused to abandon a fight even when outnumbered. For many British civilians, this was the first time they realized that the war was not only a British struggle, it was becoming a truly international fight against Nazi Germany. Meanwhile, German leaders believed that the RAF was close to collapse. Their pilots reported that they were seeing fewer British fighters in the sky. Intelligence officers misread the numbers, thinking the RAF was running out of planes and men. In reality, British aircraft production was still strong, and damaged pilots, if they survived, could sometimes return to combat after recovering. The situation was serious, but fighter command was not yet broken. Then, one night, a small German raid accidentally dropped bombs on central London. Until that moment, both sides had mostly avoided bombing the other's capital city directly. Now, London had been hit. In response, the British made a dramatic move. Bomber Command sent aircraft to attack Berlin. The physical damage to the German capital was small, but the psychological effect was huge. Adolf Hitler and Hermann Göring had promised the German people that enemy bombs would never reach Berlin. Now, in the darkness, sirens were wailing and explosions echoed over their own city. Hitler was furious. Soon, the German strategy changed. Instead of focusing mainly on RAF airfields and the air defense system, the Luftwaffe would now turn its main force against British cities, especially London. For the people on the ground, this decision would mean terror and destruction. For the RAF, it would be a strange and unexpected form of relief. By shifting the main weight of attacks away from fighter airfields and onto the capital, Germany gave fighter command a chance to breathe, to repair, and to recover. But no one in London felt any sense of relief on the evening of September 7, 1940. On that day, the capital of Britain became the main target. In the late afternoon, people in London heard a sound like distant thunder. It grew louder and louder. When they looked up, they saw a sight that many would remember for the rest of their lives. Across the sky, stretching for miles, came a vast formation of bombers and fighters, a dark moving cloud of aircraft, heading straight for the city. That day, the Luftwaffe launched a massive raid on London's docks and industrial areas. Warehouses burned, ships and cranes were destroyed. Explosions shook the ground. Great columns of smoke rose above the East End, turning the evening sky black. Firefighters fought the flames for hours. Ambulances raced through the streets. Families huddled in shelters, listening to the whistle of falling bombs and the crash of collapsing buildings. The Battle of Britain had entered a new and darker phase. Now, the question was not only whether the RAF could survive, but whether the people of Britain could endure night after night of bombing, and still refuse to give in. The next weeks would test the strength of pilots and civilians alike in ways no one had fully imagined. Night after night, the bombers came. Sirens would wail across London. People grabbed their coats, their children, a few precious belongings, and hurried into underground stations, cellars, and improvised shelters. Some tried to sleep on benches or on the floor of the tube, lying shoulder to shoulder with strangers, while above them, bombs were falling on the streets they had walked that morning. Others stayed in their houses, huddling under sturdy tables or in doorways, listening to the deep, rolling explosions and wondering if the next one would land on their street. In the darkness, searchlights clawed at the sky, sweeping back and forth, trying to find the raiders. Anti-aircraft guns fired blindly into the night, their flashes lighting up rooftops for a second at a time. And high above all of this, RAF night fighters tried to find the enemy in the blackness, often with no radar and very few instruments to guide them. For civilians, the nights felt endless. In the morning, when the all-clear signal finally sounded, people emerged into a different city. Streets they had known for years were now piles of brick and smoking ruins. Houses had no front walls, and you could see bedrooms open to the air, beds, wardrobes and pictures still hanging on broken walls. Firefighters and rescue teams pulled survivors out from under rubble. Sometimes they found people still alive in tiny air pockets beneath collapsed buildings. Sometimes they carried out bodies instead. And yet, through all of this, life continued. Buses still ran. Factories still produced aircraft and weapons. Shops opened, even if their windows were shattered. Children went to school, some in the city, many in the countryside where they had been evacuated. The government encouraged people to keep routines, to go to work, to show that bombing would not break their will. Humor became a weapon too. People made jokes about the raids, gave nicknames to bombs, and even turned some ruins into curiosities. It was a way of saying, "We are still here. You have not won." While London burned at night, the skies were still contested by day. The Luftwaffe continued to send large daylight raids, hoping to force the RAF into the air and finally destroy it. In September 1940, one particular day would stand out. On September 15th, the Luftwaffe launched what they hoped would be a decisive series of attacks. Huge formations of bombers and fighters crossed the Channel once again, heading for London and other targets. In operations rooms across southern England, telephones rang constantly. Plots on large maps showed incoming raids. Controllers directed squadrons to climb, to turn, to intercept. For the pilots, this would be one of the most intense days of the entire battle. Again and again, they took off to meet the enemy. Spitfires and Hurricanes rose in waves, climbing into the sun, then diving into the bomber streams. Dogfights broke out at different altitudes. Tracer rounds arsed through the sky. Engines screamed as pilots pushed their machines to the limit. Bomber crews looked ahead and saw British fighters coming straight toward them. Some held their course. Others wavered as aircraft began to explode and fall. From the ground, people watched small black dots twisting and turning high above, leaving white trails and sudden bursts of flame. In London, Winston Churchill visited an underground command centre and quietly watched RAF controllers at work, hearing calm voices direct squadrons into the path of the raiders. Reports came in of German bombers shot down, fighters destroyed, raids broken up before they reached their targets. By the end of the day, it was clear that the Luftwaffe had not achieved the knockout blow it wanted. British losses were real and painful, but the RAF was still very much alive. For German pilots, morale began to fall. Many of them felt that they were being sent repeatedly into a battle they could not win. They were fighting far from their own bases, with limited fuel and little margin for error. If they were shot down over Britain, they became prisoners of war. If RAF pilots were shot down and survived, they could often fly again. Slowly, the balance of the battle was shifting. The Germans had entered the campaign thinking they could break the RAF in a few weeks. Now, after months of intense fighting, they still had not done so. Instead of facing a crumbling defense, they were facing an opponent who kept coming back, and every night, even as London and other cities suffered, factories across Britain continued to turn out new fighters, replacing many of the aircraft that had been lost. The Luftwaffe began to rely more and more on night bombing, trying to avoid fighter interception by attacking under cover of darkness. The daylight raids grew smaller, less frequent, more cautious. The great armadas of August and early September were no longer so common. For RAF Fighter Command, this was not the end of danger, but it was a sign that they had survived the worst storm. Yet at the time, no one knew for sure what would happen next. Pilots still climbed into their cockpits every morning, every afternoon, ready to meet whatever came over the Channel. Air raid wardens still patrolled the streets at night, shouting lights out and guiding people to shelters. Families still listened nervously to the distant rumble of engines and the crash of bombs. The threat of invasion still hung in the air, like a shadow over every conversation. Rumors spread easily. Some people were convinced that German troops might land at any moment on quiet beaches or in remote fields. Soldiers trained on the coasts, building defenses, digging trenches, placing obstacles on beaches. Home Guard units, often made up of older men and volunteers, drilled with rifles, improvised weapons, and a fierce determination to resist if the enemy came. No one could say for certain if an invasion fleet was waiting just across the water. All they knew was that everything depended on the thin line of young men in the sky, the few that Churchill had described. In the coming weeks, the pattern of the battle would continue to evolve. and decisions made in Berlin would slowly seal its outcome. But for those living through it, each day still felt like a step on a knife edge, with the future of their country balanced above the clouds. As September turned into October, a quiet change began to spread through the German High Command. They had not broken the RAF. They had not destroyed Fighter Command. They had not forced Britain to its knees. The Luftwaffe was exhausted. Many of its crews had been flying combat missions since the invasion of Poland and the campaign in France. Now they were being sent, day after day and night after night, into some of the most heavily defended skies in the world. Losses in aircraft and experienced pilots were starting to hurt badly. At the same time, British industry was proving more resilient than the Germans had believed. Fighters lost in combat were being replaced by new Hurricanes and Spitfires rolling out of factories. Across the country, the British air defence system, with its radar chain, observers, ground controllers, and flexible command structure, was surviving the strain. The Luftwaffe began to shift more and more of its efforts into nighttime bombing. This would become known as the Blitz. London, Coventry, Liverpool, Birmingham, and many other cities suffered heavy raids in the months and years that followed. The human cost was terrible. Thousands were killed, many more were injured or made homeless. But in terms of the original goal of the campaign, something crucial had already happened. Germany had failed to win air superiority over southern England. Without control of the skies, an invasion of Britain was no longer just risky. It was almost suicidal. The German Navy could not guarantee protection for a huge crossing of troops and supplies. If the RAF still controlled the air over the Channel, German landing barges and ships would have been extremely vulnerable to British aircraft, to the Royal Navy, and to coastal defences. In private, German planners began to doubt whether Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, was possible at all. Officially, it was postponed. Then quietly, it faded away. Britain was not invaded. For people living through those months, this turning point was not always visible. Bombs still fell. Raids still came. Loved ones were still lost. But history would later look back at the summer and autumn of 1940 as the moment when Hitler's expansion in the West was stopped for the first time. On the ground, the cost for Britain was also high. More than 1,000 RAF pilots and aircrew were killed in the Battle of Britain. Many others were wounded or burned. Their lives changed forever. Some had survived being shot down only to face long, painful recoveries. Some never fully recovered at all. For those who fought in the air, their memories of that time often mixed pride with grief. They remembered friends laughing in the dispersal huts, arguing about football or music, or writing letters home, who were suddenly gone after a single mission. They remembered the smell of fuel and oil, the deafening noise of takeoff, the feel of the control column shaking in their hands as they fired their guns. They remembered the strange silence inside a cockpit when a battle was over, and they were flying back alone, with empty seats where wingmen should have been. Civilians, too, carried their own scars. Children who grew up sleeping in shelters and underground stations, families who lost houses, possessions, and sometimes entire streets of neighbors, all carried the memory of those nights of fire and dust. And yet, when we look back at the Battle of Britain, we do not see only destruction and fear. We also see something else. We see the stubborn decision of a country not to surrender, even when it stood almost alone. We see technology and organization used in a new way, with radar and coordinated command giving a smaller force a chance against a larger enemy. We see young men from Britain, the Commonwealth, and many occupied nations fighting side by side above fields, towns, and cities that they sometimes barely knew, but were determined to defend. We see ordinary people going to work after nights in shelters, helping neighbors dig out ruins, making tea for strangers, joking in the face of danger because sometimes laughter was the only answer to fear. When Winston Churchill said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few," he was talking about the fighter pilots of Fighter Command. But in a wider sense, The Battle of Britain was a story about all of them. Pilots, ground crews, radar operators, firefighters, nurses, factory workers, air raid wardens, children, parents, and everyone who refused to give in. The battle did not win the war on its own. Years of fighting still lay ahead in North Africa, in Russia, in Italy, in France, in the Pacific. But without this victory, the rest of the story might have been very different. If the RAF had been broken, if Britain had been invaded or forced to surrender, there would have been no secure base in the West for future operations, no D-Day from British shores, no steady bombing campaign against German industry and infrastructure. The Battle of Britain kept that possibility alive. It proved that Nazi Germany could be resisted, that its forces were not unstoppable. For people listening to radios around the world in 1940, from the United States to occupied Europe, news that Britain was still holding out meant that hope was still alive too. Today, when we see black and white images of Spitfires and Hurricanes climbing into the sky, of London streets filled with rubble, of children sheltering underground, it can feel distant, like another world. But the choices made in that summer and autumn, and the courage shown by those involved, shape the world we live in now. The Battle of Britain was more than just a series of air engagements over southern England. It was a test of skill, of strategy, of technology, of leadership and planning. But above all, it was a test of will. In 1940, under a sky filled with engines and smoke, Britain was asked a question: will you stand, or will you fall? The answer echoed in the roar of Merlin engines, in the calm voices of controllers guiding fighters, in the quiet courage of families emerging from shelters at dawn. They stood, and because they stood, history changed course. That is why, when we look back on those months and on the young pilots Churchill called the few, we are not just looking at an air battle. We are looking at the moment when the future of a nation, and perhaps of the free world, was decided in the skies over a small island surrounded by sea, under a summer and autumn sky filled with war.